Welcome to the Afterwords podcast, where every week we spend some time with the teacher from the previous weekend, talk about their message, talk about the passage of scripture they covered, and sometimes we get to uncover some things that didn't make it in the message. I have a feeling that this might be one of those weeks. My name is Jason. I am joined today by Justin. Justin, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Good.
I'm doing well.
Good.
Yeah, getting ready for the 4th. So, hooray for fireworks, huh?
We're getting close. Okay, so I have a icebreaker, easy question for you to begin with. You are, I don't know if people would automatically know this about you, but I don't think it's surprising. But you're like pretty outdoors type of person.
I am.
Yeah. What is your favorite outdoors thing to do besides sitting at soccer games on the sideline?
Well, if you say favorite, I'm going to run with that question.
Okay.
It would be to backpack in the mountains / fly fish, to get trout in the mountains away from glowing lights, and to make a fire out of pine, to smell the aroma. That's what I would do.
That sounds like a lot of fun. One of my favorite vacations our family's ever been on did not involve backpacking in the mountains, though that does sound fun. But we went around Alaska for 2 weeks.
Ooh.
And we were in an RV, but even an RV Alaska, you're just there. So if you don't have an RV, you're really out there by yourself. So we started in Denali, went to Anchorage, went down to Homer no, that's not even true. Seward, and I think Homer. Anyway, I don't even remember, but it was that just being like we underestimate the magnitude of how beautiful this creation that we get to be a part of.
Oh my gosh, we did a family road trip a few years back, and we went to Glacier. And, we did the going to the sun road. So you're like over, I want to say 7,000 feet. And just looking down into those valleys, we saw this herd of mountain goats, and I got to go fishing and stand in these glacial lakes that when it's 80 degrees, you can't even go in past your ankles because, the feet just turn blue and go numb instantly. But there is something about that's just so like recentering, and you see the stars better. Wonderful stuff.
That's great. I like that. So we are not going to be outdoors today. We have some very good questions. In fact, I told you that you won an award. And the award that you won is we got more questions about this particular sermon, which was about spiritual warfare, than we have gotten about any message since we started doing this podcast. In fact, we got more questions than we did about some of the topics when we did the About That series, and we actually did like a Q&A panel thing. I think everyone who sent questions were very well-intentioned. It's just, the truth is that this is a very confusing topic. So my first question for you is, there's so much you could have covered. How did you start by thinking about, what do I need to accomplish in this particular message based on the questions that people had asked that prompted us to do a sermon on spiritual warfare?
Yeah. Well, I think the just treasure trove of questions that you got speak to the complexity of this topic, how it's needing to be fleshed out, how it's something that is misunderstood or underdeveloped. How much could I say and then still leave so much unsaid? So it's almost like if you know about, World War II, people could teach a unit, people could teach a class, people could write a dissertation about it, but so much has been written and said and done. And so people may not talk about the liberation of certain concentration camps. People may not talk about troop movements, and those things really happened. But yet you've got this big topic. How do you then approach it? And so the way I think about spiritual warfare was, it's a general title, right? So we just talked about going to national parks.
Yeah.
I actually had a conversation with somebody just yesterday about them going to Yellowstone. And when I went to Yellowstone, I didn't have time to see Old Faithful. I didn't want to, there's a huge line there. I want to see Old Faithful. I hear it's very cool. I've watched videos, but I went to other places because I didn't have time. And so spiritual warfare was like me trying to put the literally thousands of people in a hot air balloon and do an overview, kind of looking over the map. And I wanted to take us to a few places that we don't usually go, that we don't usually see. So this was not a sermon about demon possession or demon oppression. Those are things that fit under a larger umbrella. So the biggest task, I think, when it comes down to preaching usually is what you decide to keep versus leave out. My notes document, I have my prep process is I have just a junk drawer. That was much longer much bigger, a lot more going on than what actually made it into my sermon. So this is one of those things where it's like, I would have loved to do a live Q&A right after. I can tell you what I would have went into if I had another 15 minutes. So it's hard. It's difficult when you get to a topic like this because so much has been said. I mean, I probably, outside of reading scripture, and I was reading all over the place, I probably read well over 400 pages of people way smarter than I will ever be, more informed on this topic. So yeah, it's a tricky thing. So I'm not surprised that people, particularly even with their lived experience, had something to say about this or wanted me to say more, or maybe even think I missed a part because I intentionally didn't go to some places. Because it's like I had to make one coherent statement. So,
yeah. And to be clear, I love that people send in questions, and if you're ever listening to the message and you have a question, you can send it to podcast@rivchurch.com. And a lot of you did. And we're going to get to some of them. And this is actually going to be one of a unique episode in that most of the things we're probably going to talk about are the things that didn't make it into the message. And that's great. I think it's super helpful. I do also just want to plug for people. You started with a quote from the Screwtape Letters.
Yeah, let's
C.S.
go.
Lewis, which is actually such a great, I mean, it's literally like a demon and his nephew?
Yeah, so he's an apprentice. He's like a junior tempter, and so it speaks to some of the hierarchy. So even Screwtape and Wormwood, they are not Lucifer. They're not the prince. So they're kind of like junior associates in the food chain of it.
And obviously, it's written by C.S. Lewis. It's not scripture, but it is such a great illustration of what is going on that we just kind of don't understand. And obviously it's completely fictionalized, but it's such a great, I love that book, and I would just encourage people who are listening.
It's not a long read. And what's chilling is Lewis had famously said, out of all the things he'd ever written, this was the easiest thing to write. Which you're kind of like, that. Why did that come so easily to talk about something demonic in this, allegory, this work of fiction? So I don't know. That's another little carrot of like, you need to read this.
Yeah. And I would recommend that if you have questions, I would start there because he paints such a powerful picture. So I do want to address, this was the most common question we got, which was, did Justin say that there would still be sin, pain, suffering, and confusion, even if there was no Satan? Wasn't it Satan who tempted Adam and Eve and introduced them to sin? Are you saying that they would have sinned anyway? And if so, where does the Bible say that? Now, to be clear, I don't think you were saying the last part.
I wasn't.
Okay.
Nope.
But I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that.
Oh, goodwill. Goodwill. Thank you. No, I think one extra word would have cleared this up for a lot of people. If I would have just said presently.
Sure.
Like there still could be present sin. So obviously you can't have our origin story with sin without the enemy.
Right.
That is what happened. So I never said individually or what have you back in the day, this would have never came to be. So that is what happened.
Yeah.
My point in pointing that out is sometimes we give the devil too much credit. We give the enemy too much credit, that we can sin. The Bible has a lot more to say about sin than it does about the enemy. So just to be very, very clear about that. So I think humanity, well, go back. We did sin, and part of that was the deception of the enemy that was embedded. However, the people were still morally culpable. We really can't get away with saying, "Oh, the devil made me do it." We could say, "Demons perhaps tempt," or "My fallen flesh leads me in one way or another." We don't know what we would do without that origin story.
Right.
We don't know. I think, and hopefully you'll ask me about this in a minute, I think we would have found a way to fall anyways. I think. That's not a biblical thing. The Bible doesn't say hypothetically we would or hypothetically we wouldn't. I think in virtue of being not God, we are fallible in our creation. And so that fall, if you will, in the cosmos had already happened in the spiritual realm. So that, the serpent was off the leash, so to speak. But what I am saying is, even if you were to bracket out the devil from our current experience or different places in our life, we would still have errors in thinking. We would still have lust. We would still have temptation. We still have flesh we need to mortify. And so often people, like, I think, hyperbolize, oh, the devil made me do it. Yes, sometimes unequivocally he's in the extraordinary. But mostly I wanted in this sermon to see him where we don't, and that's in the ordinary.
Yeah. And I think, is it fair to maybe rephrase some of what you were saying as, one, we can't blame our sin on Satan at this point. We live on this side of the fall. We have a sin nature, and around here we sort of define sin as anything that fails to reflect the image of God in our words, thoughts, and actions. That's not a quote, but
even on our nature too.
Yeah.
You know, that I am not God. I am not godly. So
and that Satan today is not necessarily the cause of the cancer that you're experiencing or
earthquakes,
the broken relationships or the earthquakes or whatever. And so I think it's helpful for people to understand that what you were saying is that we live in the circumstances we live in now as a result of being that separation from God back at the fall, but but Satan, we don't need Satan to screw up our lives at this point, is kind of what you're saying.
No, we don't. You know, and the thing is, had I more time, I would talk about what do we do as individuals when we have extraordinary experiences. And I prayed for multiple people. I laid my hands on multiple people in our lobby and outside of our building that expressed some very real, and I asked questions and are you where I'm trying to discern, are you of sound mind? Are you a believer? I literally asked, have you done psychedelics lately?
Yeah.
I really was. And I can think of two people that I talked to where I completely implicitly trust what they had to say. And I prayed over them, and I prayed that God would protect them, that God would rebuke any forces of darkness, any individual demons, those kinds of things. But I believe there are well-worn grooves in evangelical pop culture, in our bubble. We believe in the extraordinary already. So to use Pauline language, I want to supply something that's lacking. And sometimes it's a lack to see the way that the enemy might work in ideologies, in our feeder beliefs, in a more materialist sort of society. I wanted to attend to that because so often what we do is we will only attend to the extraordinary. But I think the role as preacher, as leader, is to teach, to give the uncomfortable things, to actually push our thinking, and to see where in the ordinary, in the day-to-day, how if I'm nursing a grudge, that is on me. But that can also be something that's animated by darkness as well. I mean, you see this with Jesus and Judas. Judas disobeys for silver. And then Satan enters him. Satan, not just a demon. So there's a both and dance that can happen. I don't know if that helps a bit.
Well, it is, and I think you started with a You started with a pop culture reference of The Wizard of Oz.
Yep.
And see, I was waiting for what I think is the most famous, although that's pretty famous, but the most famous reference, which is the Kaiser Sose quote, which is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled, is to convince the world that he didn't exist.
Kevin Spacey.
Yes.
Yeah.
So from The Usual Suspects. And so, but the reason I bring that up is there is another side of this, which is that oftentimes Satan would be very content if we didn't think he had anything to do with the whispers that we hear, the self-doubt in our lives, the foothold you were just describing, like don't even give the devil a foothold in this sort of thing. And I think maybe that's partially why this particular message may have resonated with so many people, is it helps us we don't understand what's going on. And while our decisions and our free will, we have to own that, it is super helpful to know that Satan will whisper the lies. They are lies, and you don't have to believe them. And not only that, we already know who eventually wins, so that should give us confidence in that particular fight.
Yep.
And is that the kind of conversations that you find yourself having with people about this? Because that's kind of the direction you took in the message.
Yeah, it was. And I looked in my inbox, and I got several emails, and I never read them the day after, or at least I shouldn't.
He just never, don't email Justin. He never reads them.
Yeah, right. Please. No, and they seem really positive. Like I can see thank you in the subject line, or this explained it. And then in the lobby, that was a lot of conversation with a lot of people that I grew up in this over-spiritualized world, or I wasn't thinking about this rightly. This filled in some blanks. This gave kind of an architecture to how all of this works. So yeah, you have to think about what's your goal when you go to a topic. If you and I are going to Disneyland and we've got 40 minutes, there's not a lot we can do. And
right.
I had 40 minutes to go to a place that people have debated and we've experienced. It's the limitations of time. Give me 4 hours next time. We'll just run that by the other elders and see how they feel.
We may run out of tape, but we'll have to record. Okay, a couple other questions that came in that I thought were really interesting. One of them was, what are the limits placed on Satan by God during the in-between times? I assume that what they mean by that is post-fall,
Second coming.
Yeah, second coming. That we live in. How much destruction can he do, and how does that reconcile with the idea that God will ultimately prevail or win?
Yeah. So one of the things that Jesus often does is he questions his questioners. And he doesn't always give a straight answer because he wants to give a better answer. I think that's
called rejecting the premise of the question.
Well, yes. It's reframing things a little bit because I want to get at something even deeper. I think the issue that is behind that question is theodicy. It looks like theodicy, it sounds like the Odyssey, Homer's epic poem with Odysseus. Theodicy. It's the vindication of God with the question of evil. So you're really asking, why does God allow evil? Why does God prevent some evil? Why does he allow something to happen? What's true in that question is that God does allow. I mean, you see this in Job 1. You kind of get this divine counsel image. Have you considered my servant Job? Whew. And I think we actually have to take several steps back when we come to this, because you can ask the same question: why does God allow Satan? Why does God allow the demons? Why does God allow disease? Why does God allow suffering? It's all under that subset of evil. And we have to go back to our understanding of a creator, our doctrine of a creator. So for God to make anything that has will, it has to have the capacity to disobey. So have you ever seen Multiplicity?
I have not.
You haven't seen that? Pop culture. So you get Kevin Spacey and Kaiser Sose. Usual Suspects is amazing.
Yeah, it's of a time when I was in college. That was the movie. Yeah.
Anyways, okay. So Michael Keaton is really busy and he has to make copies of himself. And then one of the copies makes a copy of the copy. And he's just this numbskull, whatever. So whenever you try to image God, if it's not God, it's going to be imperfect and fallible. And so when God creates, he doesn't want the robotic, and I think this is getting at something even deeper. How can God be good if there's sin, if there's evil, if there's the enemy? Like, where's the limits? The easy answer is we don't know exactly where the limits are. We're not God. We don't know the mind of God. We know that there are limits that are placed, that God does restrain evil. But in virtue of being a creator who loves will, he loves love, he loves virtue, he loves worship. You cannot have any of those things if you don't have moral free will, if we don't have agency.
Right.
Human beings have agency. The seraphim, they have agency. Everyone has a measure of agency. And so we have to be careful, because you're almost saying, and I actually had somebody have a question about this, is like, why did God create evil? James is explicit. God doesn't create evil. And so I would go back to say, okay, with the theodicy question, is if God is perfectly good and perfectly powerful with perfect foreknowledge, then we have a problem on our hands. How do we resolve this? And I think the easy ways are like trying to trouble God or say God's in some deficit, really when you're setting yourself up as the judge and say, I don't like it, so it's not true.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like there's this answer in John chapter 11, the story of Lazarus, where the sisters come to Jesus and eventually Lazarus dies, right? And they're mad because they're like, had you come sooner, there would have been no death here. But in John 11 verse 4, he says, the sickness won't end in death. he says, but it is for God's glory. That the Son of God may be glorified through it. And that feels like it's a little bit what you're saying. It's like for the only reason that God allows any of this to happen is because it gives, this is not scripture what I'm about to say, it gives them a chance to show off. Because had God prevented Lazarus, or had Jesus prevented Lazarus from dying in that moment, they would have missed out on a miracle.
Yeah. Do you do show notes for this one?
Did I do show notes?
Do you post show notes? Like right now when people are listening, could they click on a hyperlink?
Yeah, if you want me to link to something,
okay,
I definitely can. I was like, what do you mean?
Okay,
I study,
gotquestions.org has a great piece on theodicy.
Okay.
And one of the things that's pointed out in there is that there's a sense in which evil doesn't exist by itself. I'm not saying evil doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist by itself. It's almost kind of like heat and cold, light and dark. So what is dark? Dark is not presence. Dark is absence of light. What is cold? It's not something that exists by itself. It's a measure of the absence of heat.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about evil, it's an absence of good. And so what we have in the Satan, we have the adversary. That's actually a title. Is he doesn't really build and construct. He's called a destroyer. His big thing is to destroy. And so if you have a powerful, intelligent agent that's going around, he can destroy, and that's his thing. To deceive, that's his thing. To accuse, that's his thing. And so we cannot think about this rightly unless we have a cosmic scope. You were just talking about, in the end, what's the point? If all we have is this life, sometimes we see those stories and say, oh, I was bullied when I was a kid, and it made me resilient and tough, and I grew up, and when I grew up, I became a defender of people that were bullied, and it was a redemption story, right? A lot of superhero stories are like this. But what if it's the case of I was bullied when I was a kid, and then I died of cancer as a young adult? There's no redemption in that without the full picture. And so what Christianity is insistent upon, being an optimistic worldview, is that someday every tear will be removed, every wrong will be righted, all of the injustices, everything sad will be made untrue, to use C.S. Lewis's language. So you need a cosmic scope where you say someone who is infinitely more wise than me, who allows agency and will someday in his Son bring everything back together consumed, because the Son took the punishment for all of this. He dealt with all of this on the cross. So there is an element of faith to do this. Yet when we reject that, we have a lot of snuck premises. That if God was so good, he wouldn't allow fill in the blank. Truly terrible things. What we do when we do that is we really put ourselves as judge, jury, maybe executioner as well. So we have to be very careful. But I would say that gotquestions.org article does a great job, a better job than I can bumbling right here, of theodicy. That's a concept that's been studied from the church fathers, moral philosophers, anybody who is a theist, not even for Christians. But this is a huge question of what do you do with the problem of evil and the nature of good and all of that stuff. So I would say theodicy, go look it up, go get your read on.
Great. Okay. Another question that I want to address, because I want to give you an opportunity to sort of speak specifically to a group of people. This particular question asked that as someone who's experienced a demonic presence, I felt like the sermon could have been a little bit dismissive of that type of an encounter.
Yeah.
It can be very lonely when the church doesn't address these types of things. It can make it more difficult to speak up or ask for help. It feels very taboo to talk about at church. Could you speak to people from our congregation who have had these experiences? What would you say to someone walking through that today?
Yeah. Well, I would start by saying, I want to validate you. I think it's very real. That wasn't my topic. My topic was go to Yellowstone. And so my topic wasn't go to Old Faithful. Yeah. I would love to do a talk just on this and to speak intimately. So I don't want to invalidate you. I don't want to dismiss you. I believe.
Well, and that's an important distinction to make sure people hear, is like, just because we didn't have time in the message to talk about this specific thing doesn't mean that you're saying that doesn't happen.
Well, I wanted to be faithful to what I was asked.
Yeah.
And the classic passage is Ephesians 6. And Paul does not address that there. Just because he didn't go there doesn't mean that there's no there.
Right.
Right. And so, like I said, I prayed over 2 people specifically. Jason, you might have even been in a meeting where I told everyone I felt some attacks this past week. I'm not going to go into them publicly here because this is a very vulnerable thing. So I grant that. I've actually had a couple heebie-jeebie stories. We have a family story of my grandfather who passed away when I was in high school, who took part in an exorcism. He was just an enormous man going to church, and the elders asked him to help hold someone. I have those stories of I grant that as a very real thing. I could tell you stories of missionaries being in the field that have told me about witch doctors levitating. Mm-hmm. I grant all of that. So I would say to anybody who's listening, if you feel dismissed, my heart grieves in that. That wasn't my topic or my point, but I would love to go there even with you on these kinds of things. But I would say this: God, I believe, has given us biblical Christians, if I can use that term, some grace, and we recognize the extraordinary already. If you're in a situation like this, contact your elders. And we don't ever drive out demons. We don't ever repel anything. I mean, we even see in Jude, where I think it's Michael, the archangel, would say to the evil one, "The Lord rebuke you." So we need faith, we need armor, we need lots of prayer, and we need the authority of God whenever we're dealing with those things. And so I would say get mature, wise, grounded people around you to pray, to bring these things out in the dark. So I grant that to be completely real. At the same time, though, I think sometimes we're also mistaken and we attribute it. So I would say I would take everything case by case, and we need so much discernment when we come to this. I can think years ago, as an aside, I had an older friend who was struggling with infidelity. And he had, I don't want to say really taken the devil made me do it approach, but had really played up the spiritual warfare, such to the point where he had clergy and family pray over him and tell him they rebuked the spirit of adultery. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, I feel better. I feel great. I feel, And then he ended up fully blowing up his marriage with more adultery later. And I just want to be slow in these things, but I don't want to dismiss any one person and say, no, you're full of crap.
Yeah.
Nope. You could be full of truth. You could be full of the opposite of crap. So it's a thing.
Yeah.
It is a real thing. But again, my task was to look at the more ordinary ways that we're usually asleep at the wheel.
So as we kind of wrap up, as you're flying your hot air balloon over Yellowstone, was there anything else you wish you would have had a little bit of time to tap on in the message that you want to talk about here?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. I think there's one is a little bit of the overlap of mental health. If I can plug my own podcast, The Intersection with Dr. J and Friends, I have just recorded an episode with my friend Christine Kite, who is very knowledgeable about trauma and PTSD and understands a thing or two about the brain. I would want to just touch on that because I think that sometimes what we have is a Venn diagram. And so you've got the one circle that is spiritual warfare, you have another circle that is mental health, and there actually is a point of overlap where you almost have comorbidities. So it's almost like, hey, I have back pain. Why do you have back pain? Is it because I hurt my hip in high school or because I tore my Achilles in adulthood? Yes. The answer is yes.
Right.
But other people have back pain and it doesn't come from that. It's because you lifted too much, or it's because you've lived a sedentary life. There could be a lot of different reasons for why we have maladies. So we're going to address some mental health and trauma, which I think is just sin and brain chemistry. That'll probably come out next week. So if people are interested, there's another hyperlink.
Oh, that's great.
People can throw more tomatoes if they want to. I think the other thing, though, is to look at our ideologies. One of my seminary profs had said something that it sticks with me. I say it from time to time. Hopefully I continue to say it, is that people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And so it's one thing to say that the enemy is a liar and a deceiver, but it's like let's just say you and I go on a road trip together and I'm a liar. And while the liar's there with you in the car, I could just be spouting lies all the time. And then let's just say I get out and I go on my way and you keep driving. Maybe that lie stays in your head. So the liar is no longer present with you, right? But the lie is there. And so I think we do have frameworks of thinking. And I see this so much in me being a social studies person who's got a doctorate in social studies education. I see the way a lot of our even political idolatry and ideology at the same time come together. And so I'm not going to talk one partisan group or the other, but see how much vengeance we have, how much self-interest we have, how much suspicion we have, where we loathe and we despise other image bearers of God. We're not saying our opponents are right or wrong necessarily, but we are so apt to be naive and to just be so vehemently opposed to other people, and we look at their self-interest as if it's pure evil and our self-interest as if it's pure good. So that could be a place where I see a foothold in so many people, where I challenge. I mean, I even had one comment in the lobby that was so off the wall. And how did you jump from a talk about spiritual warfare to something that's inherently political? Well, I think your political formation is so deformed at times that you may not even see how you are doing the bidding of the enemy, because what you believe inherently divides. It inherently subordinates some people under others, and it's forming not the fruit of the Spirit, but the flesh inside of you. So I would love to talk just more about our ideology. You know, I was going to do a whole bit on the stay true to yourself, on the believe in yourself, the street philosophy there, how that could be more you got to edit that. Dynamic, more demonically animated than someone that says, let's go play a Ouija board. Because what did Lucifer do? He stayed true to himself. He wanted to elevate himself. So there's like a mini reenactment of that when we choose our way and my autonomy over the knowledge of God and obedience to Christ.
We did get a couple questions specifically about mental health, and I will definitely include a link to the Intersection podcast. It will not be a link directly to that episode because that episode has not come out yet when you're listening to this, but you can go and subscribe. You definitely should, and that way when it shows up, you can just listen to it. Also, hypothetically, there's a possibility that we're definitely going to possibly maybe do a week on mental health as a part of this.
A definite
series.
maybe.
There's a chance. We're not really trying to keep them a secret, but things sometimes change. And so I try to be less committal. Also, I don't have to give any of these messages. So I try to be less committal on y'all's behalf, but that's a topic that's most likely going to reappear. So stay tuned as well for that. Justin, I really appreciate your time. This was obviously a message that resonated with a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. So I appreciate it. I'll include a link to it in case for some reason you just really love the podcast but haven't actually listened to the message yet. You should definitely go back and do that. And we appreciate all of you listening, and we will talk to you again next week.